There are places in this world where the ground itself remembers, where the red clay soil, baked under a merciless sun, absorbed so much suffering that even the trees grew crooked under the weight of it. The northeastern coast of Brazil in the early decades of the 19th century was one of those places, a land of brutal contradictions, breathtaking in its beauty, suffocating in its cruelty. The sugar mills, the engenhos, rose from that landscape like kingdoms. Grand manor houses with whitewashed walls and wide verandas, surrounded by fields that stretched to the edge of the world. And inside those fields, under that unforgiving sun, thousands of men, women, and children worked until their bodies gave out. They had been taken from their homes across the Atlantic, stripped of their names, their languages, their freedom. They were the engine of an empire that called itself civilized. This is a story set inside one of those mills, a story of power and its limits, of silence and what it costs, of a woman who was never supposed to matter and ended up holding the fate of everyone around her in her two bare hands. Her name was Caterina, and this is where it all begins. The Engenho São Benedito sat on the outskirts of what is today the metropolitan region of Recife in the state of Pernambuco. In 1831, it was one of the most productive sugar mills in the entire province, and one of the most feared. Its owner, Coronel Eugenio Braga de Menezes, had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of the same family, standing on the same soil, extracting the same wealth from the same broken backs. Eugenio was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes that people said could see through walls. He was known throughout the region for 2 things, the quality of his sugar and the severity of his punishments. He kept a leather-bound ledger where he recorded every enslaved person on his property, their age, their origin, their skill, and what he called their disposition. A word that meant in his language how much resistance was left in them. The manor house where Eugenio lived was an imposing structure. Its facade faced east, so that the first light of every morning fell directly on the carved wooden doors at its entrance. 2 stories of colonial architecture, with arched windows framed in dark wood, a wide veranda supported by stone columns, and a garden that his wife Donna Perpetua tended with an obsession that her neighbors found excessive. Inside, the floors were polished hardwood. The walls were hung with portraits of ancestors. And at the center of the house, in a high-backed chair that everyone called, behind closed doors, the throne, Eugenio sat every evening to receive reports from his overseers. Behind the manor, separated by a dirt path and a low stone wall, stood the senzala, the slave quarters, a long, low building of rough stone and clay, with a single door and small windows covered with iron bars. Inside, there were no portraits on the walls, no polished floors, no high-backed chairs. There were wooden planks to sleep on, and the smell of damp earth, and the sound of people trying to hold on to the pieces of themselves that hadn't been taken yet. It was inside the senzala that Caterina was born in the year 1810, to a mother named Esperança, who had been brought from the kingdom of Dahomey as a teenager. Caterina never knew her mother's true name, only the name the colonel's father had given her. But Esperança, before she died of a fever when Caterina was 7 years old, had whispered to her daughter in their language, the language of the Fon people, that she was not who they said she was, that she came from people who stood upright, that she should never forget that. Caterina never did. By the time she was 12, she had been taken from the senzala and moved into the manor house to work in the kitchen, under the supervision of an older woman named Benedita, who had spent 30 years learning how to survive Eugenio's household. Benedita taught Caterina everything she needed to know, not just how to cook, how to clean, how to move through the house like a shadow. She taught her how to listen, how to remember. how to be invisible in a room full of people who were saying things they shouldn't. And Katerina listened to every conversation at the dinner table, to every argument behind closed doors, to the whispers exchanged between the coronel and his overseer, a thin, nervous man named Claudio, who had a habit of rubbing his hands together when he was about to deliver bad news. She listened, and she remembered everything. By the time Caterina was 21 years old, she knew more about the Braga de Menezes family than any of them knew about themselves. She knew that Eugenio had a second family in the town of Goiânia, a woman named Florinda, and 2 children he visited every other month under the pretense of inspecting a secondary property. She knew that Claudio, the overseer, had been skimming sugar from the production records for years, selling it privately and pocketing the difference. She knew that Donna Perpetua, Eugenio's wife, the woman who tended her garden with obsessive care, had been writing letters to a priest in Recife, a man named Father Augusto, that were not entirely about spiritual matters. She knew all of this, and she said nothing, because silence, Benedita had taught her, was not weakness. Silence was a weapon you sharpened in the dark for the moment when you would need it most. That moment was coming. Before we continue, we want to ask you something. Do you have relatives or acquaintances who lived through times like these, or whose families carry stories from the old sugar mill era? If so, subscribe to the channel. Share your story in the comments. You help build something real here, a community that refuses to let these voices disappear. The year was 1834. Caterina was 24 years old, and everything that had been quietly building inside the walls of the Engenho São Benedito was about to crack open. It began with the return of Rafael. Rafael Braga de Menezes was the coronel's only legitimate son, 22 years old, who had been sent to Coimbra in Portugal at the age of 15 to receive a proper education. He had gone as a boy shaped entirely by his father's world, unquestioning, obedient, certain of his place at the top of everything. He returned as something his father had not ordered and could not return. Rafael came back with books, with ideas, with a quiet, persistent discomfort that showed in the way he couldn't finish a meal when he looked out the window at the Senzala. He had studied law. He had read the French abolitionists. He had made friends in Lisbon with men whose names his father would have spat on the floor. And now he was home, sitting at his father's table, watching his father's world with eyes that had learned to see it differently. The tension between father and son was immediate and electric. Eugenio had expected a replica of himself, someone to inherit the ledger, the overseer, the leather chair. Instead, he got a young man who pushed food around his plate and asked uncomfortable questions at dinner. But what Eugenio didn't know, what no one in that house knew except Caterina, was that Rafael had already found his way to the Senzala on his second night back, that he had sat on the dirt floor in the dark and talked to the people there, that he had wept quietly in a way that surprised even himself, and that he had made a promise to a man named Sebastião, the oldest person on the property, a man whose back was a map of every year he had survived, that he would find a way. Caterina had seen Rafael enter the Senzala from the kitchen window. She had watched him leave 2 hours later, his white shirt dirty at the knees. And she had understood, in the way she understood most things, that the house had just changed. She began to watch Rafael the way she had watched everything else in that house, carefully, patiently, from the edges of rooms. She noticed that he was searching the study at night, going through his father's ledgers. She noticed that he had begun to write letters that he hid inside the binding of a law book. She noticed, too, that Eugenio had noticed something was wrong with his son, and that Claudio had been instructed to watch him. The situation inside the manor house had become a web of surveillances. everyone watching everyone else, no one knowing who held the most dangerous thread. But Caterina knew. Caterina had always known. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. Donna Perpetua called Caterina into her private sitting room, a small, lavender-scented room on the second floor where she spent her afternoons writing her letters. She closed the door. She looked at Caterina for a long moment with those pale, unhappy eyes of hers, and then she said something that no one in that house had ever said to Caterina before. She said, "I need your help." Donna Perpetua was not a cruel woman. She was, in many ways, a trapped one, married young to a man she feared, living in a house that belonged to his legacy, raising a son she loved and a reputation she was slowly losing. The letters to Father Augusto were not an affair, as Caterina had suspected. They were something more complicated and more dangerous. The priest was a member of a small, clandestine network, men and women, some of them clergy, some of them merchants, some of them landowners racked with guilt, who were quietly facilitating the escape of enslaved people to the interior, to Quilombo communities that the government knew about, but couldn't fully control. Donna Perpetua had been funneling money to this network for 2 years. Small amounts, carefully hidden in household expenses. She had never acted directly, never put herself in the path of discovery. But now something had changed. Father Augusto had written to tell her that a group of 17 people from a neighboring mill had been recaptured after an escape attempt, and that 3 of them had died in the punishment that followed. He needed more money, and he needed it quickly. He needed someone inside San Benedito who could move carefully. Caterina stood in that lavender-scented room and listened to Donna Perpetua's trembling voice, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the particular vertigo of a moment when history tilts on its axis. She could say no. She could walk back down the stairs and continue being invisible and survive. Or she could say yes. She looked at Donna Perpetua, this pale, frightened woman who had spent years watching from her garden while the world ran on suffering. And she said, in a voice so steady it surprised them both, "Tell me what you need. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think of what you've seen so far? Are you surprised by Caterina, by Donna Perpetua, by the world inside those walls? Leave your opinion in the comments. This story belongs to all of us." Bisses ici. What happened next unfolded over the course of 4 months. 4 months that would determine the fate of every person on the Engenho San Benedito. Caterina became the link. The invisible thread connecting Donna Perpetua's money, Father Augusto's network, Raphael's legal knowledge, and the people in the Senzala who had been waiting, some of them their entire lives, for a door to open. She moved through the house the way she always had, quietly, efficiently, noticed only when something needed to be done. But now every trip to the market in the nearby town carried a folded note inside the lining of her basket. Every conversation with Sebastião in the Senzala was a planning session disguised as an old man asking her to bring him water. Every evening she spent in the kitchen listening to the Coronel and Claudio talk over their accounts was an intelligence-gathering operation. She was extraordinary, not because she was fearless. She was terrified every single day, but because she had been trained from the age of 7 by a mother who whispered in a forbidden language, "You come from people who stood upright." And she had decided finally that she would prove it. The plan was this. Raphael had discovered, through his father's ledgers, that 18 people on the property had a legal ambiguity in their documentation, records that had been improperly transferred during the transition of ownership between his grandfather and his father. In theory, under the letter of Brazilian law as it stood in 1834, those documentation errors could be challenged. It would take a petition, a sympathetic magistrate, and a lawyer willing to file it. Raphael had the legal knowledge. Father Augusto had a contact in Recife who was a magistrate with abolitionist sympathies, and Katerina had the one thing that could guarantee the coronel's cooperation, or at least his paralysis. She had the ledger. Not Eugenio's sugar ledger, the other one. The small, cloth-covered book she had found 3 years earlier, hidden behind a loose brick in the study fireplace, which contained the coronel's private financial records, including the payments to Florinda in Guyana, the bribes paid to 2 provincial officials, and most devastating of all, a series of entries recording the illegal importation of enslaved people after 1831, the year Brazil's first law prohibiting the Atlantic slave trade had gone into effect. Eugenio Braga de Menezes, one of the most powerful men in the province, had been breaking the law for years, and Katerina had the proof. On a Tuesday evening in March of 1835, while the coronel sat in his high-backed chair reviewing his accounts and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Katerina walked into the study. She set a cup of tea on the table beside him, and then she set the cloth-covered ledger beside the tea. Eugenio looked at the book. Then he looked at her. For the first time in the 24 years she had lived in his house, he looked at her, really looked at her, as if she were a person standing in front of him rather than a function. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He understood. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no violence, no theatrical moment of reversal. What followed was something almost more remarkable, a negotiation, conducted in low voices in a lamplit study, between a man who had built his entire life on the premise that some human beings were property and a woman who had spent her entire life inside that premise, quietly preparing for this exact moment. The 18 people whose documentation was legally ambiguous were quietly manumitted, freed, within 6 weeks, their papers filed in Recife by Raphael with no public announcement. Sebastian was among them. So were 4 of his grandchildren. So were 11 others whose names Katerina had memorized from the ledger years before, the ones she had chosen because they had the best chance of building something on the outside. Katerina herself was freed 3 months later, in a private document signed by Eugenio, with a hand that was not entirely steady. She was given a small sum of money. Not enough to call it justice, not nearly enough, but enough. Claudio, the overseer, was dismissed 2 weeks after Katerina's conversation with the coronel, his years of financial theft apparently having been brought to Eugenio's attention by an anonymous source. He left the property on a grey morning without looking back. Donna Perpetua continued her garden and her letters to Father Augusto and her small, secret acts of resistance. Raphael stayed on the property for 2 more years, filing legal challenges, losing most of them, winning a few, and becoming a name that certain people in Recife spoke with something that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but lived somewhere between the two. And Eugenio Braga de Menezes, sat in his high-backed chair and watched his world change around him, one careful, unstoppable degree at a time. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. He never acknowledged Katerina's role in any of it. To the end of his life, he maintained the posture of a man who had made certain decisions out of the goodness of his own character. But the walls of the Engenho San Benedito knew differently. And so did the soil, red and ancient and remembering, that had absorbed every scream that was never allowed to be heard. The building still stands today, or what remains of it does. Stone arches wrapped in vines, a ruined veranda where the columns have cracked and leaned, but not quite fallen, a garden long gone wild. People who live nearby say that on certain evenings when the light falls at a particular angle and the wind comes in from the east, you can hear something in the walls, not quite a sound, not quite a silence, something in between. Katerina's name appears in no official record, no portrait hangs on any wall, no plaque marks what she did. History, as it so often does, closed over her like water over a stone, but she stood upright, and that her mother had told her, was everything. To everyone who stayed with us until this very last word, thank you. From the bottom of this channel's heart, thank you. You chose to sit with a difficult story, a heavy history, and the kind of truth that doesn't offer easy comfort. That takes something real. The fact that you are still here means that you understand why these stories matter, not as curiosities, not as entertainment, but as a debt we owe to the people who came before us and were never allowed to speak for themselves. Katerina spoke for herself. Today, we spoke for her. And next time, the best is truly still to come. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real historical conditions, real documented practices, and real places from 19th century Brazil. The characters are fictional, but their world was not. We ask that you carry that with you. Now leave us your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And when you're ready, the next video is waiting for you. We promise you won't regret it.